Hello and welcome to this online lesson. My name is Mr. Hoven, and today we'll be looking at the presidency of John F. Kennedy. If you remember from last time, we were looking at the presidency of Dwight or Ike D. Eisenhower. Well, now his 2 terms are up. The election of 1960 is about to start, and the United States will be getting a new and young president. So, let's go ahead and get started. So in the election of 1960, the Democrats offered up John F. Kennedy. Again, President Eisenhower served his 2 terms. Now it's time for a new president. The Democratic nominee, John F. Kennedy, and his opponent was Republican Richard M. stands for Milhouse Nixon. And the election results were Kennedy winning with quite a few of the Electoral College votes, as well as the popular vote. He was the man for the job and the man that people wanted. So JFK wins. He took office January 21st, 1961. He was a graduate from Harvard. He was also a World War II veteran, and his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, served as his Secretary of State. He created the Peace Corps, and his vice president was Lyndon B. Johnson. And in his inaugural address, Kennedy is famous for uttering this quote, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." So in that he's asking Americans, don't think about the me, but think about what can I do to help my country out? How can I make my country better? Not just about how I can make my life better, but the lives of my fellow citizens. Early in office, JFK made several pledges. He urged, and he made the statement, continuing this space race that began under Eisenhower, we will go to the moon. So his big push was to explore and pioneer space. He wanted to address ignorance and prejudice in the United States, and Congress under him enacted measures to boost the economy, build national defense, provide international aid to other countries, especially those fighting communism, again, the containment policy, and fund a massive space program known as NASA. So, a lot of funding is being changed around. And most of it is heading right into the NASA space program. Again, as mentioned on the previous video, most of the scientists working at NASA were former Nazi scientists. Interesting. But during JFK's presidency, there were several brushes with the communist USSR. And so remember, during the Berlin Airlift, Stalin tried to starve the people out of West Berlin, and the U.S. kind of responded by bringing in goods for about a month. So they brought in all of the things that people needed to survive so they wouldn't fall to communism, and containment was successful. Well, Khrushchev, who's the new leader of the Soviet Union, wanted to stop East Germans from escaping to West Berlin, because by 1961, 4,000 people were leaving each week. These were people that were under the communist rule in East Berlin, and they were escaping into West Berlin to find the freedoms and the autonomy to have successful lives as promised in the Western governments. So Khrushchev built a wall between East and West Berlin. It was made out of concrete, steel, and barbed wire. And it was patrolled 24 hours a day, making sure no one crossed it on either side. And it came tumbling down on November 9th, 1989. We'll be getting to that later on in this unit. But again, Berlin Wall keeps the Eastern Germans from escaping into Western Berlin. Again, putting up walls between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1959, a young revolutionary, Fidel Castro, seized power in Cuba. And this was a problem for the United States because he established a communist regime. Cuba is only 90 miles away from Florida. So now there is a communist country very close to U.S. borders. He took control of U.S. businesses and property in Cuba. Thousands of Cubans fled the country, and many came to the United States as refugees. The United States government, JFK, and the CIA knew that Castro needed to be removed from power and were willing to exact any measures to do it. So, after several months of debating, the U.S. planned an invasion of Cuba. Their plan was to use Cuban exiles living in the United States to invade Cuba. So what they would do is arm these people that have been kicked out of Cuba or that escaped and send them to the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. And this would trigger a massive revolt against Cuba and especially its leader, Fidel Castro. So the idea of sending a few revolutionaries in, other people buy into it, and before you know it, the country has completely thrown off the communist rule. So April 17th, 1961, nothing went as planned. 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. That's where it all occurred, the Bay of Pigs disaster. The Cubans living there didn't revolt. None of them stood up and joined the revolutionaries. So invaders were captured or killed, and this was a huge embarrassment for Kennedy and the United States. A failed invasion, a failed revolt, and this was kind of a win for communism, especially a little country like Cuba against the powerhouse, the United States. Now, at this time, there was also quite a bit of tension around the discovery of certain implements in Cuba. And this was when there was missiles, nuclear missiles from the Soviet Union found in Cuba. This crisis, because notice the position of Cuba with the rest of the United States, it's close. And in those rings, that's the range of the missiles it had. These were known of the 13 days that shook the world. The Cuban crisis, no doubt, was the most serious episode in the Cold War. It was also a turning point. For 2 weeks between October 16th and 28th in 1962, the world was closer to nuclear war than it had ever been. So Castro and Khrushchev were both allies. They were both communists. In October 1962, a U.S. U-2 spy plane photographed secret missiles in Cuba that could reach the United States in minutes and had a broad range. So, who could have sent these missiles to Cuba? The USSR. Here's one fun fact, though. At this time, the United States had their own nuclear weapons at a naval base in Turkey that were well within range of the Soviet Union. So we had nuclear missiles very close to the Soviet Union, but when they moved the nuclear missiles and we find out about them in Cuba, it is about to start a possible nuclear conflict. So, learning this, JFK did the following. He first demanded that Soviets remove missile bases in Cuba. He declared that an attack from Cuba would be considered an attack by the USSR because they were both allies. He ordered U.S. military to prepare for an invasion of Cuba to remove the missile bases by force. And he ordered a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent Soviet ships from delivering more missiles. And in the picture down in the corner, this is a Soviet ship being escorted away from Cuba by a United States naval ship. The stage is set for 13 days of tension, and who knows what could happen. So over the next 13 days, the world waited, and they waited, and they waited with anticipation and anxiety. What would the USSR do? What would the U.S. do? And would we end up in a nuclear war? So after these 13 days, Khrushchev offered to sit down and discuss terms of a peace treaty. And the results of this peace treaty were the USSR removed missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. removed missiles from Turkey. And now a phone line was set up between the president and the Soviet premier. The hotline, in case of further crisis, they could reach each other directly and quickly. So as you can see, we're starting to have more of a cordial relationship with the Soviet Union. It is not great, but we are starting to see some progress to cooling off this already Cold War. Now, sadly, JFK's presidency was cut short. The young man, Harvard graduate, World War II veteran, loved by the people, his life and his presidency were ended on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. President John F. Kennedy was visiting Dallas as an early stop to raise money for a re-election. While riding in the motorcade, the president was shot multiple times, including a fatal shot to the head. Lee Harvey Oswald was blamed for the assassination, but there are many controversies that surround the president's death, because there's the suspicion of a second shooter at the grassy knoll, because of the angle of his head that his head took after the final fatal shot. Lee Harvey Oswald was killed before he could testify. So there was a lot of question and controversy and theories about what really happened in Dallas, Texas. Was it the grassy knoll? Was it the bookstore? Was it the warehouse? Was there another shooter altogether? No one really seems to know. President Kennedy died when he was only 46, and now his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, took the helm. And we will be looking at Lyndon Johnson as well as the Vietnam War next in our unit. I hope you enjoyed this online lesson. We'll see you next time.